Hey, what's up guys? In this video, I'm going to be going over the operator instrument in Ableton Live. It is a synth or an instrument within Ableton Live that produces its sound via a method called FM synthesis, right? So this is operator here. I'll just drag it in. And this can look kind of confusing, but we're gonna get through it. This can be one of the more, I guess, challenging synths to wrap your head around, just because there's so much routing and so much going on. It's hard to kind of have a mental image of what's going on. Very difficult for people to kind of figure this out. But once you get it, you're like, this is awesome. It allows you to create very kind of complex sounds by modulating oscillators with other oscillators. They're called carriers and modulators. This is an FM synth. We so far have been working with, well, just analog essentially. This is a analog subtractive synth. And there is frequency modulation, right? We can do that in this synth, but it's not stable and it's not kind of linked in terms of a ratio with other oscillators. I'll give you an example of what's going on there. So I have a, let's go, yeah, sine wave. All right, so we have a sine wave here, right? And we'll just turn on the LFO. So an LFO is like a very slow oscillator, right? Very slow, between 0.1 hertz and 17 hertz. That's its maximum range of LFO-ness, right? And we use this to modulate other values. So for example, LFO1 is enabled. We'll go into the oscillator 1 and we'll go into the pitch mod here, right? We did this before. We can increase the depth of modulation between, the pitch and LFO1. So now, sounds like that, right? We're modulating the pitch. It's the same thing as kind of doing this, right? But we have an LFO attached to it. Pretty dope. Right, and we can get some really cool sounds with that. We can increase the rate. That's as high as it can go, and this is not an audio rate LFO. Audio rate means that it's above, well, generally, once you go above a certain point in frequency, you cannot discern the pitch vibration. It gets into the audio realm, and you start to hear really strong audio rate FM. But this is very slow, and we're going to be using operator, which can go very fast. This is the general idea of FM. In the analog realm, FM synthesis can't really work because it just becomes very unstable. This is done in the digital realm, and classic FM synths would be, FM8 and things like that, right? And these were digital sound, but you could create really complex sound by layering things on top of each other. And we'll get into that, but this is operator, and it's essentially a bunch of sine waves being fed into each other, right? And I'm going to kind of briefly go over what's going on here. So analog, right? Let's just kind of look at and recognize what's happening here. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, right? Because this is very important. Let's look at analog here. I'm just going to resize some stuff because I want to color on here. This is analog, right? These are oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, right? Two oscillator sound sources, and you can route them and stuff like that, but you actually can't have oscillator 2 being fed into oscillator 1's pitch, right? Just because it doesn't really work. In later devices you can do that, but this is faithful to the analog realm. So just understand what's going on here. Oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. In operator, we have things called operators, right? And they are these 4 sections here. They're just called A, B, C, and D. And they don't have octave or semitone or detune. Well, they do have detune. They don't have octave or semitone or anything like that. They have these coarse and fine, right? And these are ratios. And this is very important in how FM works. If things are slightly out of pitch and not aligned, everything just kind of falls apart. And this is the key to FM synthesis. Very important. So essentially, what we have is we have a number of generators here, or sorry, operators. These are called operators. And let's and they're all kind of they're all contextually sensitive to this main window here. And then we have an LFO and a filter and the output and all the fun stuff over here. So the general idea is it's just like analog. You kind of program it left to right, right? The same kind of thing follows here. So we have a sine wave here. Actually, no, that we have analog being played. I'll just get rid of that. We have a sine wave. And we can confirm that. It says sine. There's a number of different waves. We'll get into those in a little bit. And how it works by default when you set it up is the D goes into C and modulates its pitch. And then that gets fed into B, and then B gets fed into A. And I hope that makes sense. I'm going to do just, I guess, a tiny bit of a diagram of something we're going to do right now. So we're going to have essentially two boxes, and I'm going to pick a different color here. Okay, so let's just say we have A, right? Operator A. I call them oscillators. They're called operators, but let's just pretend that those two things are interchangeable. This is operator B, right? There's B and then there's A. A is essentially being fed into the out, right? And by default with the routing, B is being fed into A. And what is that affecting? That is affecting the pitch, right? So this is essentially acting as an LFO, much like how we were doing the pitch modulation in analog, but it's operating at a very, very fast rate in terms of, relatively speaking, with the LFO. We also have an LFO, and we can have this set to a wide range there, but it's actually not linked to a pitch. So let's look at what's actually going to happen when we start feeding, right? It's already mapped. B is going into A. We just don't have an amount yet because the level is negative infinity, so nothing's going in. If we were to hit a note, let's go down. I think it'd be worth me getting the signalizer open here. Let's look at the spectrum, and we can see how these really cozy harmonics are being produced as I increase this level. Right, and these will be the same harmonics as I move up and down the keyboard. Right. Conversely, these operators are very flexible. I can select fixed, and that will be a frequency range that I can select here, right? So this is 100 hertz. This is way faster than what we were getting in analog, which is right here, right? LFO 1, the maximum can go up to 17. And just for fun, let's actually listen to what that does, right? If I set this to, 17, which is way down there, right? We can discern the pitch vibration, right? But as we go up, we're not actually able to discern that it just becomes a sound. right? So the problem with even doing this in the analog realm with like a super fast rate is as I move up and down the keyboard, right, it doesn't sound right. It's not stable. So it has to be fixed, right? So the frequency actually turns into a ratio, which is relative to the note that you're playing. If I turn fixed off, we have control over that ratio. Let's actually look at what occurs in the oscilloscope. Okay, cool. Right, so we have a sine wave there. And what we're doing is we're frequency modulating that sine wave with another sine wave. And the phase and start time of that sine wave is very important. Right? So we're effectively bending that, and that's essentially what it is. By default, the phase is reset for all of these operators every time you hit a note, which means that it's consistent, it's locked, and that's very important. If I were to turn that off, right, so each one of these has its own separate, I guess, contextual window in the center here, right? So each one of these operators has its own controls within here. Let's actually go to phase here, and we'll actually turn this off. Right? It'll start, but it might kind of drift and things like that. I mean, it's starting at the same time, but if I were to change the course, maybe it might wiggle. Oh, wait, what'd I do? No, I have to select this one, actually. Right? We're losing that ability to have a stable FM kind of shape there. Right? Very unstable, especially if I go up like that. Right? You might be into that. You might want something evolving, which is pretty cool. But for the sake of this video, we'll just leave this on. I mean, I'm not going to claim to be an expert in FM synthesis. I don't use it a whole lot, but you know, it's there and you can get some really cool results. So there is a phase here, and it's between 0 and 100. And when you're working with phase, let's look at this here. All right, so remember I was telling you about the duty cycle of a wave, and let's just let's get the grid division here, and I want the graph color to be like so, and let's give it some space there. So essentially, yeah, we'll look at this whole thing here. So let's look at the duty cycle, right? The duty cycle down here, right? We have, let's just actually select operator A, which is what we're going to be looking at. We can see the duty cycle right there, right? And it corresponds with, this start time and then, yeah, this end time. And this window right here, it'll just repeat. And, like, kind of like that, right? This is the duty cycle. And I almost chuckle every time I say duty, but whatever. Duty cycle, right? And then this would be the zero crossing. So, that's just the thing that repeats. That's its job. That's what it does. And just as a refresher, the shorter the duty cycle, the higher the pitch, right? So as we go up and down the keyboard, the duty cycle will change speed. But there is not infinite. I mean, there are a number of places where when you press a note, this duty cycle can start, right? And that would indicate the phase re-trigger, right? So right now the phase is at 0, right? And I am assuming this is 0 because it is, and then, that's where it will start. It will always re-trigger at this when it's set to 0. At 50%, it will re-trigger the start of that sample here, and this will be, 50%. And then here would be 25. Then here would be 75. And we can actually see that. And, you know, it's called percentage here in this synth, right? But it's actually degrees in a lot of, I guess, not real world applications, but in terms of where something falls within the duty cycle, right? You have 0 degrees at the start, 360 degrees in the middle, or sorry, at the end, in the middle, it's 180, and that's how we discern the difference between two waves that are kind of operating in the same kind of plugin. Like, what's their relationship in terms of their speed? So let's actually modulate this. Sorry, let's modulate, like increase the depth of the modulation from oscillator B, which is being fed into oscillator A, or operator A, I should say. Let's look at what the phase will do, and it's really cool. Right, so we're adjusting the timbre, right, which is really cool, and that's important. Typically, you would have the phase locked for all of these, and it's very important. It'll give you like a bit more like cohesiveness within the sound, and phase is important. So these two are essentially playing at the same kind of speed. Well, they are essentially, but you know, one of the phases will be kind of, one of the operators will be out of phase from each other, but re-trigger at the same part, which gives it, I guess, more cohesion. If I were to turn that off, right, we would get somewhat of a disaster, right, and an evolving sound. So phase is important, all right, I'm just letting you know. The coarse here is a ratio of the input pitch. So these things are always contextually, you know, they fit well towards each other. Right, so that's a high frequency. A high frequency sine wave is modulating the pitch of operator A. And we can look at that, like, that's pretty cool. So that's like, super fast audio rate over top of a slightly slower audio rate. And I want to show you what these both sound like kind of separately. I'm going to go into the routing here, and I'm not going to have these routed into anything currently. So now we can actually disable this, and we can listen to operator B by itself. Listen to operator A by itself. Right? But when they're routed kind of sequentially, D, C, B, A, sounds like that. And that adds some really interesting harmonics that travel up the keyboard because it's contextual to the key that you're pressing. Okay, geez. We can offset that a little bit by increasing the fine tune. Right? And that kind of sounds like a little bit of a, what would you call it? Some decimation, a little bit, but it's there if you need it. So let's actually do a thing now. Let's actually bring the whole pitch down a little bit, and we do that with the key. We can increase the level here. And this might sound familiar. Each of these operators, it has its own envelope, and I'm going to select operator B, go into envelope, and bam, there's our envelope. Each one of them has an envelope, which is pretty cool. Let's bring that down, right? It's an A, D, S, R, and we can actually, move things around in this screen here. Right, so it starts at a loud volume and then teeters. And this kind of sounds like a toy keyboard. And that's essentially how those kind of toy keyboards produce their sound with FM. So it's not just, having this value blasting, which you can, right? You get like a Rhodes sort of thing if you do that. Really interesting sound. But if we have the envelope, which is always mapped and modulating the output level, it does things like that. What we can do now is we can, because we know the routing, D into C, C into B, B into A, we can increase D. And this won't do anything because it's being fed into C and the output of C is down. So keep that in mind. You'll be moving things and nothing will be happening. You have to keep note of the routing, which we'll get into. C can actually modulate the pitch of B, and we can do that. Right, and that'll give it some really interesting harmonics. I'll actually kind of, disable this envelope. We can hear it. And we can bring the ratio up. Right, super rich harmonics there just by using a bunch of sine waves. And if you remember, a sine wave is just a fundamental. And let's look at the oscilloscope here. Really interesting sound, or what it looks like there. And we can add some really cool stuff with the envelope here for B. And get some really cool stuff there. Let's move on to some other things. We can further do some interesting stuff just by experiment. We can actually modulate the pitch of C, which is modulating the pitch of B, with this operator here. But we'll have it, not have it. We'll have it fixed at a ratio. Not a ratio, a frequency amount. Right? And what is that doing? That's giving us a metallic kind of sound. Right? And I can adjust the envelope of this one and kind of see what happens. Right? It's all experimentation. It kind of sounds like you're hitting a pan or something. You get a really cool effect with that. So let's get rid of that, and I'm going to open up a new operator window here. And I want to show you how the fixed actually works. So I'll select fix, oscillator A. All we're hearing is oscillator A or operator A. They're interchangeable. I keep on saying that, but that's just how my brain works. Right? So no matter what key I press, it's 100 hertz. And I can move this up. I could do all sorts of fun stuff with that. And then there's a multiplier. Right? We can multiply 116 times 10. We can go way up and do some really cool stuff. We can actually kind of divide it by, 10 times 0.1 would be 1. This would be 1 hertz. And we can see that there, which is pretty neat. Can't hear it, but yeah. We can do all sorts of stuff. We can even have really, really slow modulation. Super slow. Come on, dude. Here we go. Stop. Anyway, yeah. And, that's coming through, but you can't actually hear it. But anyway, really cool. And this gives you the opportunity to have very fast LFO modulation. Well, LFO means low frequency oscillator. I don't know what you'd call it. You'd call it, a fixed modulation. And you can get some really cool sounds with that. Let's go back to this. So we're going to focus on oscillator 1, or operator A, I should say. Well, I'm not confusing you, but these are the two windows we're going to look at. So again, oscillator A, or operator A, has these really cool envelopes within them. and we can do some stuff with that. And the controls are controllable here: attack, decay, release, and we can map these to velocity, how hard you press the key, which is part of humanizing things. So we can go in the piano roll and adjust the timing of this to automatically change dynamically based on the velocity. All sorts of fun stuff with that. We can also loop the envelope. With the time and things like that. So we can get some really interesting things with modulation within the kind of higher order operators, and all sorts of things with that. We got beat, which we can have it synchronized. It's quarter. Right? Things like that. And super useful and fun to go about doing that. Bunch of ways to have this, but let's just go none because we'll just leave this as an envelope. But with the beat or syncing, we can essentially get some rhythmic sounds out of this, like kind of built in, and that you can achieve a great effect with that. So there's that. There's phase and retrigger. Right, so retrigger means that it will always start on the, I guess, 0, which would be the 0 degrees, and the 50 would be that it would start at the, I guess, halfway between, so it'd be kind of inverted. And this doesn't sound like anything, but it does make a difference. We can see the phase changing. We can adjust the phase and it'll change here, which is pretty cool. So there's a number of different waves we can select, and you'll quickly realize that as we modulate waves with more complex waves, you get more of a complex sound. I'll give you an example of that. So we have the sine wave here, and we'll go back over to the envelope. There's two windows here. I'll go over what this means in a moment, but here we go. Let's go into this oscillator here, operator. And let's go saw, right? So this is a saw wave. Looks like so. Kind of steppy. I'll get into that in a moment. Right. We've changed the timbre of that sound. Really interesting. And there's a number of these kind of shapes. So sine is a very mathematical sign. And I'll show you what that is down here. The sine 4-bit, if we remember the bit depth, it will have a little bit of noise. I mean, a lot of bit of noise. It's stepped. And this can give you a really cool effect. Kind of mimics the older gear that these kinds of things are based off of, the equipment from the late 80s, early 90s that did FM. And then, sine 8-bit, we have more resolution, right? But, we can't actually see it in the oscilloscope, which is the time domain. We can see it in the spectrum, right? And this probably be more appropriate to what a DX7 would produce in terms of its bit depth. With varying amounts of saws, and why they look like that, we'll get into the additive aspect of this synth a little bit later. So as we move up these saws, that means that there's more sine waves added together to create that saw wave. Right? So you may be asking yourself, what the heck is going on there? So a while ago, someone discovered that any sound can be produced with nothing but a bunch of sine waves. And that freaked people out, but it's been kind of demonstrated, and that is additive synthesis. Additive synthesis is stacking a bunch of sine waves together with different phases and volumes to create, you know, a sine wave or a saw wave or any kind of wave, really. So right here, this is saw 3. We can see that there are 3 bins, and these are all done with ratios. So, you know, we have our sine wave here, and we can add a bin here, right? And we can slowly add these things in, right? That's a terrible saw wave, but that's the general idea, right? And we can add more and more bins to achieve that shape. Right? Squares, you can make a square using a bunch of sine waves, right? And they are spaced out differently, which is pretty neat. Then we have the digital square, which has, you know, super high resolution, triangle, and then noise. These aren't, noise is not related to the FFT sort of thing. But yeah, a sine wave is just one harmonic, one sine wave, so you just have one sine wave here. And funny thing is, you know, people don't believe that you can make any sound with sine waves, or you can translate a sound to sine waves, even though we do that all the time with FFT. And then, yeah, people don't believe it. I don't understand why. But yeah, it's just one of those things. Anyway, let's look into, yeah, let's modulate something interesting with something interesting. So we have let's do saw 6, which is pretty cool looking. And then we'll modulate operator A with operator B. Right, so we're getting more of an aggressive sound, right? And changing any of these waveforms or wave shapes, we get a completely different sound. Right? So all sorts of stuff. Right, so let's look at that. We'll do that with the envelope here for operator B. Right, super interesting sound there. And we can see in the spectrum a lot of movement there. And this is the basis for making, I guess, bass guitar sound, I guess, in synthesis. We can go bananas there. I can't really get into the details of this, but you know, maybe one day soon. I can see Live making an additive synth, fully featured additive synth in the future, because there's a workhorse called Harmer that does this. It's really cool, and this will also work really well for the filters, which brings me to my next point. The filters here. There is a filter tab. It works exactly how you would expect, and it has its own envelope. Right, and the envelope, we can adjust the shape here. The envelope percentage is the envelope amount, which is sent to the frequency here. Right, there's aspects of additive synthesis which we are now applying to this. Right, all sorts of fun stuff. The envelopes are very intuitive. And all sorts of fun stuff like that. The shaper and the different modes of filters I'm going to get into, these apply to a number of different devices in Live, and I kind of want to go through them all at the same time. But the filter is fantastic, and it's the same quality as the rest of them. right? 24 and 12 dB per octave modes with resonance and all that. I want to point something out as well. We have the ability to add an LFO, right? And by, the heart of this synth, these are all essentially LFOs, but this LFO can be used on a number of different things. And it can add some really cool modulation. So there is a rate, and this one goes pretty fast, even though it says low. It's also retriggerable, which is important. And that'll make sense for what we want to do. Right, we can get right up into, I guess, high. That's a good rate. We'll increase the amount. Right, that's instability there, but you get the idea. We can get pitch going on there. And by default, it's pitch. And we can set the destination to, any of these operators. Right now, we'll send it to oscillator B. And if I have this envelope of oscillator B a little bit tighter, right, we can get some weird stuff there. Bring that up. Right, as an example, it might be a little bit too short. Right, and that LFO is always retriggerable. We have it, the LFO retrigger is set to on. This LFO also has its own envelope. So, just to add to the confusion, it'll have its envelope, and this will affect the amount. All sorts of fun stuff like that. We can have the key, as we move up and down the keyboard, the rate will get faster. Right? We can get some cool sounds with that. And the amount, you can have the velocity of the MIDI note affecting the amount here. So we can get some nice humanization there. Also the same loop, we can have loop going on. And get some interesting movement in there. And we can get really, I guess, interesting effects if we just modulate one value and not the other. Right, and get some stuff going on there. Right, kind of weird. Let's get the filter going on. And you can also route this LFO just to the filter. Get some kind of Ocarina of Time stuff going on there. That's the first thing I thought of. Really fun. Also, we have, that was just destination A. We can select destination B for, I guess, a number of different things. We can do something called amplitude modulation, and we can do that for, let's say, B, right, which would be this one. And if I do that, right, we're modulating the level essentially. Right, and we can have the amount here 100 or negative 100. I want to go down. Oh, down. right? So we can really get in there if we have different envelopes, the LFOs affecting things, and destinations, key and rate amounts, and you can get really into it. Right? So that is that. There is a pitch envelope here. This is an envelope dedicated to pitch, and I believe, yeah, it can affect the pitch of kind of any destination, be it A, B, C, D, or LFO. So let's just select A and see what that sounds like. Right, so A is essentially what we're hearing. Right, so the envelope amount we can have selected up there. Right, and that's a little bit, not stable. Let's do it for all of them so they're contextually locked in. Right, and this can add a nice little, like, picky transient. Right, okay, so I went out. The sustain I have below, I need to actually keep that at 0. And I'll go into the decay and set it that way. Right, and if I look at this area right here, I can actually bend it. And all sorts of stuff like that. Yeah, I'll leave the peak like so. And let me just get that decay. Right? Isn't that interesting sounding? We can not do that to any of the operators. We can affect the LFO and do some stuff with that. And I'll just move that around. Right, we can get some really cool stuff with that. We can have this affecting, I'll just set the sustain back to normal there. Right, I don't want it to go below 0 because it might, well, it will bring the pitch down after the envelope settles, which is something that I don't want. Destination B, we can have this to, the volume of A, B, C, or D, which is kind of pointless. Let's go, we can do maybe LFO rate. And do some stuff with that. Or better, I guess, the overall volume. Or something. All sorts of stuff. And this might be better for oscillator feedback, which I'll get into a tiny bit later. We have the ability to kind of slightly detune the left and the right, and this is done with spread. This will make it, I guess, wider. A wider sound. There's separation between the left and the right, and this will make your sound, I guess, more spacious and interesting. Transpose is a global kind of transpose, and it affects all operators. Right, so that'll give you the ability to move the course around and kind of dial in how you want it to sound. And this is FM synthesis right here. It's pretty cool. Let's go down into this area right here. This is the kind of global rate for all envelopes. So it's a kind of a percentage depending on what's going on. And so it's like a one-stop shop for automating some really cool stuff. You don't need to go into each envelope and change things around. It's really useful. Right, really neat. And then tone, and what that does is that I think that essentially rounds things off. Let me read this. Operator is capable of producing timbres with very high frequencies, which can sometimes lead to aliasing artifacts. The tone setting controls the high frequency content of sounds. Higher frequencies are typically brighter, but also more likely to produce aliasing. This is something that we need to take into account. For the most part, using this, you don't need to worry about it because there is high quality interpolation and anti-aliasing filters built in. Tone, what it does, I believe, is it will kind of window what's going on and then average things out to make it a little bit more smooth. Like, it's not an EQ, it will actually kind of smooth things out. If you have super fast modulation right at the high end, it will effectively kind of round off those high end frequencies so that it sounds a little bit more appropriate. It's done with math and something called windowing, I believe. Right, and it's just called tone, but it does more than just EQ, so don't get that confused. Time will, yeah, I already went over that. Volume is the overall volume out. So this is where a lot of the routing lives. So right now we have, these colors mean something. So, this orangey color is D, blue is C, green is B, and yellow is A, right? And we've so far been looking at, this one going into this one going into this, and then this one going into this, and then this one going into the output, right? There's different kinds of routing. We can have the C and D both going into and modulating the B operator, and then going into the A. We can have all sorts of different routing. And if you want to experiment, we have all these different things available to us. We can make a cool patch and just be like, hey, what does it sound if we just change it to this? Whoa, what is that? That is pretty dope. And this is, the usefulness of routing. And then here it would kind of act like a subtractive synthesizer. They would all be fed into the output stage. None of them are modulating any others. Right? So all sorts of cool stuff can be done. Right? And it's contextual to the area that we are clicking. These are all the, I guess, modulators here. We can set the note velocity we can have set to any of these values. Key, have it set to any of these values. Aftertouch, which is a different thing. Pitch bend and mod wheel we can have set to, a bunch of sources. By default, pitch bend is set to pitch, and the range is +5. So it will kind of bend up and down. We haven't used pitch bend yet, but I'll show you how that works. And yeah, we can just select anything, and we can have an amount here in terms of what's going on. So you have a lot of control in the MIDI realm, the MIDI value realm, that will kind of allow you to play around with things. So much fun stuff. You can have velocity controlling multiple things. Even, in here, it does stuff really, really flexible. And we'll get into complex modulation in the next synth we're going to be looking at, which is the flagship synth that this program has. Voices will allow the polyphony amount, right? So one voice would mean essentially one note at a time. So one note would be all of these oscillators, the filter, the LFO, and all that fun stuff put together. Right? Two voices would be a completely separate thing, different filter, different operator. a section, right? Right, and that's how kind of voices work. And voices are very important to kind of wrap your head around. And you can have up to 20 voices going on. Retrigger, this is a global retrigger, I believe. When enabled, notes which are already playing will be retriggered rather than generating an additional voice. So what does that mean? This deals with long release times, right? And this will just kind of keep the note with its kind of phase that's already going on. Not something you really need to worry about 99% of the time, but it's a good thing. Interpolation, it will kind of smooth out those really fast audio rate modulations, and that will kind of apply some math to the sound, so you don't get like super fast, harsh, rough sounding sounds in there. And then anti-aliasing, it will essentially oversample and then apply filtering. As far as I know, this is a little more rougher on the CPU, but a modern CPU can handle multiple instances of operator. It's no longer, 1998 anymore, or sorry, 2006 when this came out. We don't need to worry about that much. Pan and things like that. Pan with what key you're pressing, and then we can have random pan to give us some movement in there. And that's the general kind of operation of operator. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope you learned stuff. Take care and have a good one.